Hello, and welcome to today's lesson of Day in Life in Ancient Egypt. This lesson you may take notes, and if you do not catch up to this lesson, please go on to the Google and search Day Life in Ancient Egypt. As I'm reading from the article written by Joshua J. Mark, published in 21st September 2016. Alright, let's start. Okay. The popular view of life in ancient Egypt is often that it was a death-obsessed culture in which more powerful pharaohs forced the people to labor at constructing pyramids and temples, and at unspecified time enslaved the Hebrews for this purpose. In reality, the ancient Egyptians loved life, no matter their social class. The ancient Egyptian government used slave labor as every other ancient culture did, without regard to any particular ethnicity. The ancient Egyptians did have a well-known contempt for non-Egyptians, but this was simply because they believed they were living the best life possible in the best of all possible worlds. Life in ancient Egypt was considered so perfect, in fact, that the Egyptian afterlife was imagined as an eternal continuation of life on earth. Slaves in Egypt were either criminals, those who could not pay their debts, or captives from foreign military campaigns. These people were considered to have fortified their freedom either by their individual choices or by military conquest, and so were forced to endure a quality of existence far below that of free Egyptians. Now, the individuals who actually built the pyramids and other famous monuments of Egypt were Egyptians who were compensated for their labors, and in many cases were masters of their art. These monuments were raised not in honor of death, but of life, and the belief that an individual life mattered enough to be remembered for eternity. Further, the Egyptians believed that one's life was an eternal journey and death only a transition inspired the people to try to make more their lives worth living eternally. Far from a death-obsessed and dour culture, Egyptian daily life was focused on enjoying the time one had as much as possible and trying to make others' lives equally memorable. Sports, games, reading, festivals, and time with one's friends and family were as much a part of Egyptian life as toil in farming the land and erecting monuments and temples. The world of Egyptians was imbued with magic. Magic, Heka, predated the gods and in fact was the underlying force which allowed the gods to perform their duties. Magic was personified in god Heka, also the god of medicine, who had participated in the creation and sustained it afterwards. The concept of Ma'at, harmony and balance, was central to Egyptians' understanding of life and the operation of the universe. And it was Heka which made Ma'at possible. Through the observance of balance and harmony, people were encouraged to live at peace with others and contribute to communal happiness. A line from wisdom text of Ptahhotep, the vizier to the king Dejkare Essesi, 2414 to 2375 BCE, admonishes a reader. Let your face shine during the time that you live. It is the kindliness of a man that is remembered during the year that follow. Letting one's face shine meant being happy, having a good spirit in belief that this world makes one's own heart light and lighten those of others. Although Egyptian society was highly stratified from a very early period, as early as a pre-dynastic period in Egypt of c. 6000 to 3150 BCE, this does not mean that the royalty and upper classes enjoyed their lives at the expense of peasantry. The king and court are always the best documented individuals, because then, as now, people paid more attention to celebrities than their neighbors, and the scribes who recorded the history of time documented it was the greatest interest. Still, reports from the later Greek and Roman writers, as well as archaeological evidence and letters from different periods of time, show Egyptians of all social classes valued life, enjoyed themselves as often as they could. Very likely people in the modern days as well. Now let's look at the population and social classes. This is a subtitle. Let's move into that. The population of Egypt was strictly divided into social classes from king at the top, his vizier, the members of his court, regional governors, each eventually called nomarchs, the generals of the military, government overseers of work sites, such as supervisors, and the peasantry, which is the lowest. Social mobility was neither encouraged nor observed for most of Egypt's history, as it was thought that the gods had decreed the most perfect social order in which mirrored that of the gods. The gods had given the people everything and had set the king over them as the one best equipped to understand and implement their will. The king was intermediary between the gods and the people from the pre-dynastic period through the Old Kingdom. When the priests of the sun god Ra began to gain more power. Even after this, however, the king was still considered God's chosen emissary. Even the latter part of the New Kingdom, when the priests of Amun at the Thebes held greater power than the king, the monarchs was still respected as the divinely ordained. Now let's look at the upper class. The king of Egypt, also known as Pharaoh, until the New Kingdom period, as the God's chosen man, quote, enjoyed great wealth and status and luxuries unimaginable to the majority of the population. Okay, unquote. It was the king's responsibility to rule in keeping with Ma'at, and as this was a serious charge, he was thought to deserve those luxuries in keeping with his status and the weight of his duties. King is often depicted hunting, and inscriptions regularly boast of the number of large and dangerous animals a particular monarch killed during his reign. Almost without exception, though, animals like lions and elephants were thought by royal game wardens and brought to preserves, where the king then hunted the beasts while surrounded by guards who protected him. The king would hunt in the open for the most part, only once the area had been cleared of dangerous animals. Members of the court lived in similar comfort, although most of them had little responsibility. The nomarchs might also live well, but this depended on how wealthy their particular district was and how important to the king it was. The nomarchs of a district, including a site such as Abydos, for example, would expect to do quite well because of the large necropolis there dedicated to the god Osiris, which brought many pilgrims to the city, including the king and courtiers. Nomarchs of a region which had not such traction would expect to live more modestly. The wealth of the region and the personal success of the individual nomarch would determine whether they lived in a small palace or a modest home. This same model applied generally to scribes. So now let's look at the scribes and physicians. Scribes were valued highly in ancient Egypt, as they were considered specially chosen by the god Thoth, who inspired and presided over their craft. Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson notes how the power of written word to render permanent a desired state of affairs lay at the heart of Egyptian belief and practice. It was scribes' responsibility to record events so they would become permanent. The words of the scribes etched daily events in records of eternity, since it was thought that Thoth and his consort Seshat kept the scribes' words in eternal libraries of the god. A scribe's work made him or her immortal, not only because the later generations would read that they wrote, but because the gods themselves were aware of it. Seshat is a patron goddess of libraries. Librarians carefully place one's work on her shelves, just as librarians in her service did on earth. Most scribes were male, but there were female scribes who lived just as comfortably as their male counterparts. A popular piece of literature from Old Kingdom known as Dwarf's Instructions advocates a love for books and encourages young people to pursue higher learning and become scribes in order to live the best life possible. All priests were scribes, but not all scribes were priests. Priests needed to be able to read and write to perform their duties, especially concerning mortuary rituals, as doctors needed to be literate to read medical texts. They began their training as scribes. Most diseases were thought to be inflicted by the gods, and punishment falls in order to teach a lesson. And so doctors needed to be aware of such which gods or evil spirit or ghost or supernatural agents might be responsible. In order to perform their duties, they had to be able to read the religious literature of the time, which includes works on dentistry, surgery, the setting of broken bones, the treatment of various illnesses, as there was no separation between one's religious and daily life. Doctors were usually priests until later in Egypt's history, when there was a secularization of profession. Yeah. All of the priests of the goddess circuit were doctors, and this practice continued even after emergence of more secular physicians. As in the case of scribes, women could practice medicine, and female doctors were numerous. In the 4th century BCE, Agnodes of Athens famously traveled to Egypt to study medicine, since women were held in high regard and had more opportunities there than in Greece. Now let's look at the military. The military prior to the Middle Kingdom was made up of regional militias conscribed by nomarchs for the certain purpose, usually defense, and then sent to the king. At the beginning of the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom, Amenemhat first performed the military to create the first standing army, thus decreasing the power and prestige of nomarchs and putting the army directly under his control. Now, after this, military was made up of upper class leaders and lower class rank and file members. There was possibility of advancement in a military which was not affected by one's social class. Prior to the New Kingdom, the Egyptian military was primarily concerned with defense, but pharaohs like Tutmosis III and Ramses II led campaigns beyond Egypt's border in expanding the empire. Egyptians generally avoided to travel to other lands because they feared that if they should die there, they would have a greater difficulty reaching the afterlife. This belief was a definite concern of soldiers on foreign campaigns, and provisions were made to return their bodies of the dead to the Egypt for burial. There is no evidence that women served in military, or according to some accounts would have wanted to. The papyrus Lansing, to give only one example, describes life in the Egyptian army as unending misery leading to an early death. It should be noted, however, that scribes, essentially the authors of Papyrus Lansing, consistently depicted their job as the best and the most important, and it was the scribes who left behind most of the reports on military life. Right now, let's look at farmers and laborers. The lowest social class was made up of peasant farmers who did not own the land that they worked or the homes they lived in. The land was owned by the king, members of the court, nomarchs, or priests. A common phrase for the peasants to start the day was, "Let us work for the nobles." The peasants were almost all farmers, no matter what other traits they cultivated, or ferrymen, for example. They planted and harvested their crops, gave most of it to the landowners, and kept some for themselves. Most had private gardens, which women tended while the men went out to the fields. Up until the time of Persian invasion, 525 BCE, the Egyptian economy operated on the barter system and was based on agriculture. The monetary unit of the ancient Egypt was Deben, which, according to historian James C. Thompson, functioned as much as a dollar would in North America today to let customers know that the price of things, except that there's no Deben coin. Okay, a Deben was approximately 90 grams of copper. Very expensive item could be also priced in Deben of silver or gold, which proportionate changes in value. Okay. The lowest class of society produced the goods used in trade and therefore provided the means for the entire culture to thrive. Now, brewers were also highly respected, and breweries were sometimes run by women. In early Egyptian history, in fact, they seem to have been entirely operated by females. Beer was the most popular drink in ancient Egypt and was frequently used as compensation. Wine was never that popular except among royalty. Workers at the Giza plateau were given a beer ration 3 times a day. The beverages was thought to have been given to other people by the god Osiris. The breweries were presided over by the goddess Tenenet. Okay. The beer was taken very seriously by Egyptians, as the Greek pharaoh Cleopatra VII learned when she imposed a beer tax. Her popularity plummeted more from this one tax than of her wars with Rome. The lower class could also find opportunity through work in metals, gems, sculpting, the exquisite jewelry of ancient Egypt. Gems mounted delicately on the ornate setting was all created by members of the peasantry. These people, the majority of the Egyptian population, also filled the ranks of the army and in rare cases could become scribes. One's job and position in society, however, was usually handed down to one's sons. Now let's look at the homes and furnishings. These artists were responsible for creating the furnishings for the lavish palaces, upper-class homes, and temples of Egypt, as well as the tombs, which were considered a person's eternal home. The king, his queen, and family lived in palace, which was richly decorated and had their needs tended to by servants. Scribes lived in or near the mortuary or temple complex in special apartments and worked from a scriptorium, while, as noted, nomarchs lived in greater or lesser accommodations according to their level of success. The peasants who provided the food for the upper classes also helped build their homes and supplied them with chests, drawers, chairs, tables, beds, while they themselves could not afford any of these things. By contrast, the palace of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, known as Malkata today, covered over 30,000 square meters and includes spacious apartments, conference rooms, audience chambers, a throne room, and receiving hall, a festival hall, libraries, gardens, storerooms, kitchens, a harem, and a temple to the god Amun. The palace's outer walls were painted bright white, while the interior colors were vibrant blues and yellows and greens. The entire structure, of course, had to be furnished, and these articles were supplied by the lower class workers. In its time, the palace was known as the House of Rejoicing and other similar names. It is known as Malkata today, from the Arabic word place where things are picked up, owing to the massive debris field found there from the ruined palace. Just imagine being at that palace, full of luxuries and wonderful items. Now, the apartments and homes of the scribes, as with those of the nomarchs, were opulent and modest, depending on their level of success, of course, and the region in which they lived. Let's look at the next subtitle of crime and punishment. How is it daily? How is it like in ancient Egypt? So, in ancient Egypt, as in every era of human history, the wealth of one person was often coveted by another who might choose to steal it. In such cases, Egyptian law was swift. After the New Kingdom there was a police force, but even before this time, people were brought before the local officials charged with crime ranging from spectrum of criminal activities, and same as in modern day. The state did not involve itself in local affairs unless the criminal had been robbed or vandalized state property, such as robbing and defacing the tomb. Judgment and justice were ultimately the responsibility of the vizier, the king's right-hand man, who delegated that responsibility to officials beneath him, who further delegated to others. Even prior to the New Kingdom, there was an administrative building in any city called the Judgment Hall, where cases were heard and verdicts rendered. In small towns and villages, these courts might be held in the marketplace. The local court was also known as the Kenbet, made up the community leaders of the sound moral judgment, who would hear the cases and decide on a guilt or innocence. In the New Kingdom, the Judgment Hall and the Kenbet were gradually replaced by oracular judgments, in which the god Amun would be consulted directly on the verdict. This was accomplished by a priest of Amun, asking the statue of God a question and then interpreting his answers through various means. Sometimes the statue would nod its head, and the other times there would be different signs given. And if the defendant were found guilty, then punishment was swift. Most punishments were fine for minor offenses, but rape, robbery, assault, murder, tomb robbing would result in mutilation, cutting off the nose, ear, hands, incarceration, forced labor, essentially the slavery for life in many cases, or even death. The great prison at Thebes held convicted felons who were used for manual labor or on the temples of Amun and Karnak and other projects. There was no death row in Egyptian prisons, since a person who was found guilty of serious offense meriting the death penalty was executed immediately. There were no lawyers to argue a case, no appeals made after a verdict was rendered. The priests were entrusted by people to give a fair and just hearing to any complaints, and to judge according to the precepts of God, knowing that they faced a far worse fate in afterlife should they fail in these duties. Now let's look into the family and leisure subtitle. Priests could be male or female. The chief priests of any religious cult was usually the same sex as the deity they served. The head of the cult of Isis was female, and that of the cult of Amun was male. Priests could and did have families, and their children usually became priests after them. This was a paradigm for all of the Egypt. As far as successions went, children carried their occupations of their parents, usually the father. Women had almost equal rights in ancient Egypt. They could own their own businesses, their own lands, and their own homes, could initiate divorce, enter into contracts with men, have abortions, and dispose of their own property as they saw fit. This was a level of sexual equality which no other ancient civilization approached, and which modern era only initiated under duress in the mid-20th century CE. At least 4 women ruled Egypt, best knowing 2 being Hatshepsut and Cleopatra. This was not the norm, however, as most rulers were male. A royal woman, for the most part, had slaves and servants who cared for the children, had no responsibility for cleaning and tending for the home. They assisted their husbands in receiving foreign dignitaries and advancing certain policies. Women of the upper classes knew a similar lifestyle, but might have taken more time caring for the children, while the lower classes, the care of the home and the children were wholly woman's responsibility. Marriages in ancient Egypt were more of a secular than a religious affair. Most marriages in any classes were arranged by their parents. Girls were usually married around the age of 12. Boys were around the age of 15. Royal children were often betrothed to those of the foreign kings to seal treaties when they were little more than infants, though it was forbidden for women to leave Egypt as brides for foreign rulers, since it was thought they would not be happy outside of their own land. Since Egypt was the best of all places, it was considered disrespectful to a young woman to send her off to some lesser place. It was perfectly acceptable for foreign-born women to come to Egypt as brides, however. Once in Egypt, these women were accorded the same respect as natives. Women of all classes were considered on par with their husbands, even though the man was considered the head of household. So although the wives of farmers did not go out to the fields with their husbands, they still had plenty of work to do, keeping the house clean, tending to the animals not used to in plowing, administering to the needs of the elderly in the family, and raising the children. Women and children would also tend the family garden, which was an important resource for any family. Cleanliness was an important value of the Egyptians, and one's person and homes needed to reflect that. Women and men of all classes bathed frequently, priests more often than any other profession. They shaved their heads to prevent lice and cut down on maintenance. When an occasion called for it, they wore wigs. Men and women also both wore makeup, especially kohl, under the eye, to help with the sun's glare and keep the skin soft. Tomb inscriptions and paintings also often show men and women plowing and harvesting the field together or building a home. The life of an ancient Egyptian was hardly at all work. However, they found plenty of time to enjoy themselves through sports, board games, and other activities. Ancient Egyptian sports included hockey, handball, archery, swimming, tug of war, gymnastics, rowing, a sport known as water jousting, which was a sea battle played in a small boats in the Nile River, in which jouster tried to knock the others out of his boat while the second team maneuvered the craft. The children were taught to swim at an early age, and swimming was among the most popular sports, which gave rise to other water games. The board game of Senet was extremely popular, representing one's journey through life to eternity. Music, dance, choreographed gymnastics, and wrestling were also very popular among the upper classes, hunting large and small games was a favorite pastime. There was also a sport called shooting the rabbits, which is described as Roman playwright Seneca the Younger, who lived in Egypt. The people embarked on small boats, two to a boat, and one rows while the other bails out water. Then they are violently tossed about in the raging rapids. At length they reached the narrowest channels, and swept along by the whole force of the river, they controlled the rushing boat by hand and plunged head downward to the great terrors of the onlookers. You would believe sorrowfully that by now they were drowned and overwhelmed by such a mass of water, when far from the place where they fell, they shoot out from a catapult, still sailing, and subsiding waves does not submerge them, but carried them onto smooth waters. After or even during such events, spectators enjoyed their favorite beverage, beer. The favorite recipe most often consumed was heket, a honey-flavored beer similar to but lighter than the later mead of Europe. There were many kinds of beers, and it was frequently prescribed as medicine, as it made the heart lighter and improved one's spirit. Beer was brewed commercially and at home, and was especially enjoyed as many festivals and the Egyptians celebrated. Now let's look at the festivals, food, and clothing. All of the Egyptian gods had birthdays which needed to be celebrated. And then there were individual birthdays, the anniversaries of great deeds of the king, observances of acts of gods in human history, and also funerals, wakes, housewarming events, and births. All of these and more were celebrated with a party or a festival. Festival of ancient Egypt were each unique in character depending on nature of the event, but all in common drinking and feasting. Let's see clothing in ancient Egypt. It was linen woven from cotton. In the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, women and men both wore simple linen kilts. Children were naked from birth until the age of 10, and most people of every social class went barefoot in emulation of gods who had no need to wear footwear. On special occasions, or if they're going for a long journey, if the weather is cold, they wore sandals. The cheapest sandals were made of woven rushes, while the most expensive were made of leather or painted wood. Sandals did not seem to have a great deal of importance to Egyptians until the Middle or New Kingdoms, when they became to be seen as a status symbol. A person who could afford good sandals was obviously doing well, while the poorest went barefoot. These sandals were often painted and decorated with images, which could be quite elaborate. One's earthly life was only a part of an eternal journey, and one's death was seen as a transition from one phase to the next. A proper burial was of utmost importance to the ancient Egyptians of every class. The body of deceased was washed, dressed in wrappings, which also known as mummified, and buried with those objects which they would want or need in the afterlife. The more money one had, and of course one's tomb and grave goods, the more they would have. But even the poorest people provided proper graves for their loved ones. Without a proper burial, one could not hope to move on to the hall of truth and pass judgment of Osiris. Further, if a family did not honor the dead properly at death, they were almost guaranteeing the return of that person's spirit, which would haunt them and cause all manner of trouble. Honoring the dead did not only mean paying respect to that individual, but to individuals' contributions and achievements in their lives, all of which were made possible by the goodness of the gods. So living mindfulness of kindness, harmony, balance, and gratitude towards the god, they helped to find their hearts lighter than the feather of truth when they came to stand judgment before Osiris after death. Once they had been justified, they would pass on to their eternal life, so they will continue the daily life as they had left in ancient Egypt when they died. Everything in their lives which seemed lost at death had returned in its afterlife. Their emphasis in every aspect of their lives was to create a life worth living for an eternity. Well, no doubt many individuals often failed at this, but the idea was worth striving for and imbued the daily lives of ancient Egyptians with a meaning and purpose which infused and inspired their impressive culture. Now this concludes our lesson for a day in the life of ancient Egypt. So if you want the proper article, please Google Day in the Life of Ancient Egypt. It's in www.ancient.eu/article/933 Day Life of Ancient Egypt. Okay, thank you for listening. Good night. Goodbye.